We've got some normal cases to review today in a good way. This is the SilverStone Fara 515XR, and it's a $68 case with 4 included 120mm rainbow fans. So these are different from RGB fans. So this case is sort of an experiment for SilverStone where they launched it to the Asia market, but they're considering bringing it to the Western market. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that this is a sort of shorter tower in an almost older school way. It doesn't have that 4090 depth to it, which is okay because in a $68 case, probably not buying that kind of card. The other reason though is those fans, and we'll talk about that. And then this is the 514X. This is a more traditional $100 case that takes the approach of about 5 or 6 years ago when making a $100 case meant ventilating it and shoving 4 fans into it. There was a period of time where SilverStone made our #1 recommended sub $100 cases, like with the RL06, but it's been a few years, and we're back to see if SilverStone can repeat. The 514X is a conventional mesh-fronted budget case, the kind that SilverStone has been selling for years now. And the 515XR is the one that SilverStone's been reluctant to bring to the US because the company feels this market has different expectations, primarily for size. And so this is also a unique opportunity for us to look at what the difference is when a company has the same sort of line of cases, but a $30 difference. Let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course, we built a website for our CEO Snowflake because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. So 515XR is one of the more interesting ones because it's one of the, those are not captive. It's one of the cost-saving measures among the cheapest cases that we've reviewed anytime recently. We're gonna start though with the 514X, which will allow us to look at the higher end of the two options. So the 514X is that more traditional approach of shove as many fans in as possible, bring the price down as much as possible, and by doing that, they are cutting a lot of corners intentionally for cost saving to try and create a 4-fan, heavily ventilated box. This has been done with careful cost saving and has become more difficult in recent years, though there are still good options. We'll actually soon be reviewing the Lancool 207 as a budget high airflow case as another new example. That's supposed to be $80. In the 514X, there are several areas of obvious cost saving, and SilverStone directly acknowledged some of them to us. The expansion slots have punch-out disposable covers, and there are no rubber grommets on the cable cutouts. SilverStone pointed out that it still made an effort to ventilate the slot covers, even though they're disposable. But disposable slot covers on a $100 case does seem a little bit too cheap even for this configuration. As for the lack of grommets, SilverStone advertises that a steel cover plate hides the cutouts and the cables routed through them. That's the theory, at least. We couldn't get the cover installed in its stock position. Fortunately, there are 2 options for placing the cover, or it can be removed entirely, although the built-in GPU support relies on it. Moving the cover only requires 1 screw, which is nice, and it's our policy to leave everything in place as much as possible for stock thermal testing, but we were forced to shift the cover forward to get the 24-pin power cable to even connect. The hard drive cage itself is only compatible with 3.5-inch drives. So 2.5-inch drives have to be mounted to the back of the motherboard tray. So basically right away, you're seeing the effect of a lot of different cost-saving areas on the case where it's corners that we're not used to seeing cut these days on $100+ cases. But the reasoning for that, and we'll see how this does in the thermal testing, is to accommodate those 4 fans, although SilverStone has some pretty steep competition these days. In fact, the product manager, when we met with SilverStone at Computex this year, said of this case market to me, it's a bloodbath out there. And he was referring to the fact that it has gotten so difficult to make cheap, competitive cases that anyone can still make any money on. Now, according to our contacts, reasons for this include things like tariffs or cost of supplies going up. But for a consumer, it doesn't really matter. Because what matters is, can you get something cheaper that's better? And as long as that's still true, then the companies still have to compete on those grounds. Some other interesting things with the 514X. The fan ARGB hub uses a SATA power connector and takes input from a button on the front panel for built-in patterns. and an ARGB header for external control. The hub doesn't have PWM speed control, though there are unpopulated pads for it. And even if it did, all 4 case fans are 3-pin. That's not something we see very often these days. We always connect case fans to the motherboard headers for thermal testing, which always allows speed control via voltage if they're 3-pin for us. The only advantage of the hub in this situation is that SilverStone uses it to pre-manage the potential rat's nest of cables. Each of the fans has a daisy-chained ARGB connector as well, so if you have 1 free ARGB header and 4 free fan headers on your motherboard, you can get rid of the fan hub and connect everything to the board. The front fan mounts are also kind of interesting, so these are limited to, this is a little risky, something that's going to have a lot of force going straight towards the camera. Okay, all right. It's all under control here. So there's 1 set of fan rails for these fans. It's the 120s. So if you wanted to swap the fans out, you're stuck with basically exactly what's already in there. And since the whole point of this case is trying to save money but still include fans, we think it doesn't really make sense to plan a build with the intent of swapping these fans, because at that point you might as well just buy a different case that doesn't include fans and is cheaper or maybe the same price but just has better build quality elsewhere. Now on the plus side, there's space to move the front fans back into the interior side of the chassis behind those rails, which would actually give additional intake surface area at the cost of GPU clearance. As for radiator support, there's support for rads up to 360mm on both the front and the top mounts, but the front mount is easier to work with due to the case dimensions. We had to angle the top one in. There are a couple of other minor budget-related points. No thumb screws for the expansion slots. As you saw earlier, the thumb screws on the panels aren't captive. There's a loose square of mesh for the power supply filter. That's something we'd typically expect, say, several years ago on one of the $60 cases, so things have certainly changed, and a chassis that was definitely originally built for a different case, evidenced by the unused side panel snaps and slot for a power supply shroud extension that doesn't exist. So reusing some tooling here, which isn't a bad thing if they're able to sort of amortize that cost. And reusing tooling actually is exactly how this price category of cases has historically been the most competitive. So the Fantex P400 series, when they finally made the P400A, which was the airflow version, and they did the digital variant, somewhere around or a little under $100, it was a very high performing case. That was all ancient tooling by the time they made it. That was a way to save on cost, but also still make a case that's decent with just some updates to the tooling. So reuse of tooling isn't a bad thing. Now, on the positive side, the 514X's front panel is almost entirely metal, and it's very sturdy metal. So not only does it have this sort of chamfered edge to widen the area of potential intake, but it also helps provide some support and structural rigidity to the panel, where even though the case is relatively cheap, it doesn't feel like one of the flimsier, cheaper panels that we've worked with over the years. So the build quality we think of some of these panels is actually pretty damn good. The snaps are another area where on that front panel, those are also metal and they're nicer quality. There's a GPU support that's included with the case, also a nice touch. The snaps are good, and although the GPU support in that location isn't the most helpful, it doesn't hurt. Also a positive, in spite of its low price, the 514X, which again is the more expensive of the two we're reviewing today, the front I/O includes a USB Type-C port. The Type-C port in particular is still one of the most expensive cable features for a case, so we're happy to see that one here. We've spoken to manufacturers before about colors and pricing. Black has been the most broadly popular color for years, so it's the most common and also the cheapest. Low margin budget cases still are most likely to reflect the price differences in the retail prices, like the King 95 Pro, where it's a little bit higher for white, and hence the white 514X is $110 instead of $100. And now we'll get to the case that I'm more interested in between the two, which is the 515XR, the cheaper one. It's actually a lot cheaper, and despite being cheaper, it's not necessarily worse than the 514X. It's kind of a weird scenario where they're not the same tooling, they're not identical, so it's not just like a stripped down version of this. They are different cases for all intents and purposes, but the 515XR ends up with actually some better quality of life features than this case. Just its downsides are what made SilverStone second guess the potential of shipping it to the US market. You can let them know in the comments what you think. So 515XR is about 33% cheaper. It's a huge drop in price, and SilverStone is concerned about two main things. One is, again, this dimension, where, I mean, realistically, as long as they're listing the dimensions and the usable space, it's kind of on the user to check those against the card they're purchasing. But in this scenario, there's a higher chance than typical that there's going to be a collision, so check the specs if you're going to buy it. The other reason, though, is the rainbow fans. The fans in the 515XR aren't ARGB, which is fine, but since most cases are photographed with a rainbow pattern for RGB on retail sites, this is going to lead to confusion. The term rainbow fans, combined with marketing images of multicolored fans, might imply baked-in RGB lighting patterns and controllable options for people. Instead, each of the fans has a set of static, non-animated, multicolored LEDs that can't be turned off since they're powered by the connectors. This is an older school approach for price. We wouldn't mind some old school solid color LEDs with that, or no LEDs at all. But we're not sure about the rainbow choice. According to SilverStone, rainbow fans are more common in the Asian market, from which the 515XR originates. Out of the box, the fans are all connected to a single 4-pin Molex adapter. We recommend leaving this alone. The fan cables are too short to reach anything on their own, and if you drop fan speeds, the LEDs dim. They run on the same circuit. Those of you who built computers in the early 2000s will remember this behavior from the earlier LED fans. The 515XR is nearly identical to the sawed-off form factor of the old Fractal Meshify C. The Meshify C was a case that came out back in 2017, and in the brief span after optical drive bays and before the really massive GPUs. But in 2024, 4090s exist, so SilverStone's worried that the 515XR is only compatible with GPUs up to 350 millimeters long. Now, what we said to SilverStone back in Computex was we don't really see this as an issue because people buying a $68 case are probably not buying a $1,600 to $2,000 video card. And although there are longer cards for cheaper, like the 7700 XFX model, that comically large card, there's still plenty of options that are short enough to fit within this limitation, especially for a $68 case. We would recommend limiting the GPUs to about 300 millimeters though, to give the case fans some space to breathe and move air around. If your GPU is larger than that, there's just better options out there. Like the 514X, it doesn't make sense to replace the 515XR stock fans. However, unlike the 514X, the XR actually has 140mm mounts at the front, making it a little more reusable later. Here's another kind of weird improvement in this one, the cheaper one, over the 514X. The drive cages actually are more useful in the 515XR. They're more flexible. They can mount either 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drives. The cage has a removable sled with vibration damping, and the dedicated 2.5-inch mounts are separate and held in with thumb screws, all of which are improvements over the 514X. The power supply mount in the 515XR also has foam supports that the 514X lacks, and there's a single reusable expansion slot cover. The 515XR has two internal 120mm fan mounts on top of the power supply shroud. We generally don't see much thermal improvement from shroud top fans without careful planning, like in the Antec Flux Pro. And in this case, the 515XR shroud is mostly sealed, so it won't do a lot. Still, it's an option that the 514X lacks. Now, another limitation of the size is 360mm radiator support, where on the front, technically, it could fit, but there's only 32 millimeters of clearance between the end of the power supply shroud and the front where the fans would be. So we wouldn't recommend installing a 360 in the front of this. As for the top, technically it can fit radiators up to 280 millimeters, but this would make it difficult to use any of the cutouts at the top edge of the motherboard. There are some cheap quality of life improvements we'd like to see here. First, the cutout nearest to the 24-pin power header is almost too small. It wouldn't really cost anything to change that size if they had done it up front. The cutouts along the bottom edge of the motherboard are partially blocked by the power supply. Next, the reset and power buttons aren't marked. Not a huge deal, you can figure it out, but it's a really small quality of life improvement to make. Finally, the rear fan is positioned so that it needs to be fully removed before installing motherboards with built-in rear I/O covers. And as a final note, we asked SilverStone why the black version of the 515XR is listed as 20 grams lighter than the white one, assuming it could be a typo. But the PM says that white paint requires a thicker coat and that the white fans also weigh slightly more than the black one, so the 20-gram difference is real, if maybe irrelevant. All right, getting to the thermals, we're gonna keep this really simple today. We're reviewing basically two cases in one, which complicates things a little bit. We're mostly gonna be comparing these two to each other. However, there are some really competitive alternatives on the market, like insanely competitive. The Fractal Pop Air RGB is probably among the closest matches to these SilverStone cases, and lately it has been stupidly cheap. It's been going on sale for like, I think I saw one for like 60 bucks. It might be as low as 50 for the non-RGB variant. So it's gotten really incredibly cheap. in a way that is almost impossible to compete with for these two cases, but we're going to look at it thermally and see how they do. Montec's Sky and Air cases are also potentially strong competitors, but we haven't tested those yet. We'll add those to the charts as soon as we get a chance. All right, let's get into the thermals. Our first test is for noise-normalized thermals, where we set all cases to the same noise level in our hemi-anechoic chamber. Neither the 514X nor the 515XR offer fan control out of the box, but we were able to perform the noise-normalized test by connecting the fans to motherboard headers as usual. The 514X averaged 48 degrees Celsius above ambient to all core and 52 degrees for the P cores, while the 515XR was significantly worse at 53 all core and 57 for the P cores. The 515XR's dual layer front panel is more restrictive, while the 514X's front panel is a single layer of steel mesh, which we like. The 514X isn't especially impressive outside of its price when compared to the rest of the cases on this CPU thermal chart, but it's tied with the Pop Air RGB, which has been heavy on the sales lately. The 515XR has some of the worst results on the chart, tied with the stock Height Y60. This is a letdown, and it's not at all what we expected. We've seen plenty of cheap mesh-fronted cases punch well above their weight, like the Lian Li Lancool 215, the Montec X3, and the Air 1000, and several Fantex cases like the P400A with the mesh front. And at the end of this week, we'll be adding the Lancool 216 back to the charts along with the 207, so that'll give them some perspective as well. The industry has moved away from multiple layers of material in mesh front panels, which has led to better performance in many cases. The 515XR could be something special if it had not made this design decision. Our standardized fan test replaces all stock fans in the case with the same set of 3 Noctua fans. There's 2 140s for intake, which we forced into place, and 1 120 exhaust. We've explained why there are limitations to this testing multiple times, such as worsening the performance of cases which include more or larger fans. However, we run this test due to popular demand from the audience. You can find our methodology and the limitations of this testing linked below. This is the perfect chance to see how the stock fans affect the performance of the SilverStone cases, as opposed to the designs of the chassis themselves. GPU temperature in the 514X averaged 43 degrees Celsius above ambient, 49 in the memory, and 56 hotspot, which puts it in the middle of the chart, tied with several other similar mesh-fronted front intake configurations like the Flux Pro, the Torrent, and the Pop Air RGB. That's confirmation that the 514X's front panel and general layout are at least as good as other cases in the same category. The 515XR, though, averaged 49 degrees for GPU, 57 on memory, and 64 on hotspot, which puts it among the worst results on the chart for the second time in a row. Again, all of these results were recorded using the same set of fans, so the difference comes down to the 515XR's front panel. The 514X seems fine. It's the 515XR that's a problem. In the same test, the 514X's CPU temperature average of 40 degrees above ambient still came close to the other mesh-fronted cases, but the Flux Pro, the Torrent, and the Pop Air all averaged 38 degrees. This is with the standardized fans. The 515XR was again worse at 44 degrees, but the bottom of the chart is stacked with bottom intake configurations, so it's not among the worst results. Front or side intake is significantly better for CPU thermals with our test bench that's showing here. Back to the noise-normalized results, neither of the SilverStone cases did well for GPU thermals. The 514X averaged 50 degrees above ambient, 58 memory, and 65 hotspot, with only 2 previously tested cases doing worse, one of them being the Pop Air RGB. The 515XR is the new hottest result on the chart. We express all temperatures as degrees above ambient to account for fluctuations. So the average GPU temperature of 54 degrees above ambient translates to a log steady state temperature of about 75. That wasn't enough to cause throttling, but a warmer room with this GPU might lose some boosting. This is the full speed chart with stock fans, so back to those. The 514X's stock fans topped out at 1300 to 1400 RPM, while the 515XR's were 1100 to 1200. Those limits are a little low for 120 fans, which makes them relatively quiet. However, this is important and probably intentional because both of the cases are set to run all the fans at 100% speed out of the box, partly because of the LED discussion we had earlier. With all 4 fans maxed out, average all-core CPU temperature of the 514X was 44 degrees above ambient while maintaining a noise level of 34.6 dBA. It matched some louder cases like the 36.8 dBA King 95 Pro, but only slightly outperformed the quieter 31.3 dBA Pop Air RGB. The 515XR tied the Pop Air for noise, but had worse thermals, as usual. The front panel design really prevents it from doing as well as it could. In noise-normalized testing, VRM and RAM thermals aligned with the CPU thermal results. The 514X averaged 34 degrees above ambient for the VRM and 28 for the memory. It's in the middle of the chart here, while the 515XR averaged 39 for the VRM and 32 for the memory, which is the hottest result on the chart in both categories. Now, all these temperatures are completely fine at the component level, just comparatively, it's not performing as well. So like I said at the beginning, this is a pretty normal case review in a way that's refreshing. It really does. I mean, I even filmed this in the old style because it just felt like it deserved it. Felt like the old office where we were looking at a lot of cases like this where they were sort of just fine and trying to hit the same market, which is the heavily ventilated, as many fans as possible, make bigger number better for fan count, and then ship it and hope it does well. So it's an older approach, although older here is maybe, we're talking 2017 to 2020 era of PC cases before things got crazy expensive. So the 514X, we'll start with this one. That is the most normal of the two cases. It is $100. It has the most basic features you'd expect of a budget case, as in a cheaper than this case, like a $70, $80 case. But it also has the full set of 4 ARGB fans. Thermal performance didn't look amazing compared to the rest of our chart, but we haven't yet fully populated the chart with comparable $100 cases. We have more of those coming out on Friday, actually, in our next video for cases. Performance is similar to the Fractal Pop Air RGB, so you can look back at that review for a rough comparison versus a wider selection of older cases if you want that. The 514X isn't bad, but we're not excited about it. And we've seen the Fractal North on sale recently for as low as $110, which is also actually insane. Which kind of brings me back to the quote from Tony from SilverStone. Tony has been a rep at SilverStone for something like 10 years now. He's very technical. He's extremely involved in the product and knows everything about all the cases. Great to work with. And SilverStone has been fiercely competitive in some specific areas of cases. So the ones we've liked the most have been the most mechanically complicated that we've showed off at Computex for years. Other ones that we've liked, the NAS cases. We used one of the mini home server boxes for our previous server, and it worked out fantastically. Excellent design overall, good drive positioning, built-in solutions for SATA connections, all that stuff. But these cheaper cases, the quote he said again was, it's a bloodbath out there comment. And for companies that don't do the same volume as the biggest case companies on the market, that might be even more true, because they can't reach the same low levels as some of their competition. So it's really interesting how the case market below $100 has changed so wildly over the last couple of years. But Lian Li in a couple days is probably going to be showing us what a modern take on the sub $100 market might look like. So check back for that one. That's going to be the $80 207. So there's still hope for the sub $100 market. It's just tougher. Anyway, the 514X is okay. We were excited about the $68 515XR mostly because of the price, especially after seeing that it has almost every feature we care about from the 514X, except the Type-C header. Below $68 is the domain of DIY PC and Sama, and there are a few name brand options with reasonable ventilation at that price, not many. At least not many that we know and have firsthand experience with. The Fractal Pop Air, when it drops that low, is one of them, though, and that's a pretty good case. Unfortunately, however, for the 515XR, it reminds us strongly of the Thermaltake Versa J24. The J24 was extremely similar to the 515XR in several ways. But most importantly, it had a layered front panel that hurt its performance. For that review, we were able to remove the filter and improve the J24's performance without changing its appearance, but that's not an option with the 515XR. So here's where we stand on this. The 515XR is almost a really competitive case at this price. That front panel is kind of what we're hung up on, where in this market, there are not a lot of cases that are easy to recommend that aren't just on sale. So if it's a good case, but it's on sale and it's in this price class, a little different, it's pretty easy to recommend, but it's not a permanent price. As for cases that are actually permanently at this price, Montec's sort of starting to get into this range. We have one where, I forget what it's called, the X, might be the XR actually, that we saw at Computex. We'll be looking at that soon. So there are some options, but there's not a ton of them that are good from major brands that have a history of build quality. SilverStone was almost there. If they make some tweaks to this case, it could be a wholehearted recommendation from us. However, right now, both of these kind of tick the box of it's okay. And that's not a bad thing for a cheap case, but if there's better ones, especially stuff like Fractal with their insane price cuts they're doing right now, I don't know if they're getting ready to launch something or what, but it just makes it really hard for these cases to compete. Anyway, we'd love to see some alterations to the front panel for the 515XR, because it could be a pretty serious competitor if SilverStone does that. And either way, it's fun to at least look at some SilverStone stuff again. They're not bad, they're just okay. And hopefully the next stuff we get in from SilverStone will be some of the the more interesting cases that we really liked over the years. We'll see what we can get in. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Fun to do a pretty standard, older style case review. If you've been around on the channel for a while, then you probably remember this format, and leave a comment. Let us know what you think watching it now that we've kind of evolved things over the years. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.